They said the river would hide them. In the winter darkness, with the fog hanging low over the banks of the Sauer, German soldiers waited in silence, believing the night and the forest would shield their crossing. What they did not know was that the old rules of survival on a battlefield were about to disappear. No foxhole, no trench, no log-covered bunker could save them from what was coming. The first shells arrived without warning. They did not slam into the ground. They bloomed in the air above the waiting men, bursting in cold light and steel. When the echoes faded, the silence that followed was haunting enough to make even veterans question what kind of weapon could erase an entire battalion in moments. This was not ordinary World War II artillery. And it was not an accident. It was the arrival of the proximity fuse, a technology once dismissed as impossible, now capable of turning every near miss into a lethal strike. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, it would change not only the fate of those trapped on that riverbank, but the future of warfare itself. How did a miniature radar, hidden inside a shell smaller than a beer can, rewrite the laws of the battlefield? Today, we trace that story back to the beginning. The road to the proximity fuse did not begin in the forests of the Ardennes. It began thousands of miles away over the waters of Pearl Harbor. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, as Japanese aircraft dove out of the sky, American gunners did what they had been trained to do. They set the timers, loaded their shells, and fired volley after volley. But the truth became clear almost immediately. World War II artillery was not built for the speed and altitude of modern air power. Most shells detonated far below their targets. Some failed entirely. And in Honolulu, the blasts of American time-fused rounds falling back to Earth killed civilians who never saw an enemy plane. What had once been a trusted defensive weapon was suddenly exposed as an aging idea struggling to survive in a new war. Aircraft were faster now, more agile, rising beyond the reach of calculations done by hand on the deck of a ship. A gun crew could estimate altitude, dial the fuse, and pray their timing was correct. But prayer was not a fire control method, and in a war that would soon cover half the globe, prayer was not enough. The concept of a proximity fuse had been imagined before. Scientists in Germany, Britain, and the United States understood the dream. A shell that could sense when it neared a target and detonate at precisely the right moment. But every nation that tried to build it hit the same wall. The inside of an artillery shell is a violent place. When fired, a projectile is slammed with forces exceeding 20,000 times the pull of gravity. It is spun to more than 25,000 revolutions per minute. Traditional electronics simply shattered under conditions like these. German engineers, after exploring over 30 designs, declared the task impossible. The British refused to accept that verdict. In 1940, they developed early models for rockets, which experienced gentler acceleration. But rockets were not artillery, and their circuits failed whenever engineers tried to scale the technology upward. So the British made a decision that would reshape the future of the war. They packed their most secret designs into a black metal box and sent them across the Atlantic in the hands of the Tizard mission, hoping that American industry could accomplish what British laboratories could not. In Washington, the responsibility fell to a quiet physicist named Merle Tuve and a small team within the Carnegie Institution. Tuve understood that theory was not the issue. Execution was. If a radar-based fuse was going to survive inside World War II artillery, it needed to become something the world had never seen. A complete electronic system, the size of a thumb, rugged enough to endure the shock of firing, cheap enough to produce in the millions, and simple enough for sailors to use without hesitation. The list of requirements bordered on the impossible. But the war did not care about impossibilities. The Pacific was burning, American ships were dying under kamikaze and dive bomber attacks, and without a better fuse, the Navy could not hold the line. Tuve and his engineers had months, not years, to solve a problem that had defeated entire nations. What came next would prove that persistence, not theory, decides the course of war. The first proof that this strange new device worked did not arrive in a laboratory report. It came from a warship at sea. In August 1942, the cruiser USS Cleveland steamed into the Chesapeake Bay with a simple assignment: fire at radio-controlled drones and see whether the new shells were worth the secrecy that surrounded them. The gunners loaded rounds tipped with the unfamiliar noses of the proximity fuse and took aim. 4 shells left the barrels. 3 drones fell out of the sky. Officers on deck stared through their binoculars, wondering if someone had rigged the test. For anti-aircraft crews who had spent years watching time-fused shells burst harmlessly in empty air, the difference was staggering. These rounds did not need a direct hit. As long as the shell passed within roughly 70 feet of the target, the tiny radar in its nose sensed the aircraft and triggered detonation. Shrapnel did the rest. For the first time, World War II artillery aimed at the sky was no longer hoping for a miracle. It was doing what it was supposed to do. What followed was not a single breakthrough, but a quiet revolution in factories across the United States. Section T moved into a larger home and became the Applied Physics Laboratory under Johns Hopkins. Around it, a web of industry formed. More than 24 major contractors and over 100 companies contributed parts and expertise. A factory that once made organs now built fuses. A plant that once turned out Christmas tree lights began producing miniature vacuum tubes. Each proximity fuse contained roughly 130 tiny components, assembled by workers who often had no idea what they were building, only that it was vital to winning the war. By early 1943, the Navy began shipping proximity fuses to the Pacific Fleet. There were still restrictions. The shells were to be used over open water, so that any dud would sink beyond the reach of Japanese engineers. Even with that limitation, the effect was immediate. In 1943, American ships fired just over 9,000 proximity-fused rounds and destroyed 61 enemy aircraft. That meant a kill for roughly every 155 shells fired. Traditional time-fused ammunition had needed more than 3 times as many rounds to bring down a single plane. As the war moved toward the Marianas and the great carrier battles of 1944, proximity-fused technology matured alongside American naval doctrine. Task forces operating deep inside Japanese-controlled waters now carried a defensive curtain the enemy could not see but could not ignore. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese aviators, many of them the best their navy had left, flew into walls of fire laid down by 5-inch guns using proximity fuses. They found that skill and experience could not overcome mathematics and engineering. Each pass toward the fleet carried a rising probability of death. Nowhere did this become more apparent than off Okinawa in the spring of 1945. By then, Japan had turned increasingly to kamikaze attacks, hurling aircraft packed with explosives directly at Allied ships. Conventional World War II artillery could seldom stop a determined suicide pilot who was willing to ride his plane into the side of a destroyer. But proximity-fused fire changed the geometry of the fight. Instead of trying to punch a single hole in a single aircraft, American gunners filled the sky in front of the oncoming wave with timed bursts that exploded automatically whenever they came close to a target. On May 11, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley took up radar picket duty off Okinawa and faced more than 100 attacking aircraft in less than 2 hours. Its 5-inch guns, loaded with shells tipped by the proximity fuse, tore into the attackers. By the end of the engagement, Hadley had shot down 23 planes, while the nearby USS Evans accounted for 19 more. The after-action reports did not mince words. The new fuse was not just useful, it was indispensable. Across the Pacific, results like these were rewriting the expectations for what World War II artillery could do. A weapon that had once relied on guesswork and timing wheels was now guided by invisible waves and tiny, rugged electronics. Yet even as the Navy embraced the proximity fuse at sea, the Army was still forbidden to use it over land in Europe. The secret was too valuable. One unexploded shell in the wrong field might give German scientists exactly what they needed. That policy would hold right up until the winter of 1944, when the forests of the Ardennes erupted and the Battle of the Bulge forced commanders to reconsider what was more dangerous, losing a secret or losing the war. At 5:30 on the 16th of December 1944, in a forest that seemed half asleep under winter clouds, the German army proved it was anything but finished. 3 armies crashed into thin American lines in the Ardennes, catching green units and exhausted veterans alike off guard. Radios crackled with broken reports of tanks on the move, infantry flooding through the trees, and outposts being overrun. Within hours, what would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge had begun. In a fire direction center near Monschau, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson listened to one of those calls. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, lightly equipped and spread thin, was being hammered by German infantry. They needed fire support now, or they would cease to exist as a fighting force. Axelson knew what his guns could do. He also knew what they could do with the crates of newly arrived shells stacked in his ammunition bunkers. Rounds marked with red bands and the code name POSIT equipped with the proximity fuse. On paper, the choice was simple. The Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, had not authorized the use of proximity-fused World War II artillery against ground targets in Europe. The risk was clear. One dud in German hands could expose the technology and threaten Allied air superiority. In practice, the choice came down to seconds. Men were dying now. Regulations could be argued about later. Axelson gave the order. The guns of the 406th Field Artillery Group opened up, sending posset shells screaming over the treetops. Instead of burying themselves harmlessly in the frozen ground, the rounds detonated 30 to 50 feet above the advancing German infantry. Shrapnel rained downward into foxholes, slit trenches, and log-covered positions that had been designed to defeat conventional shells. Within minutes, the attack on the 38th Cavalry stalled, then collapsed. The first land-based use of the proximity fuse in Europe had done exactly what its designers had predicted and something German scientists had declared impossible. Word of the results traveled faster than the shells themselves. Within days, Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity-fused artillery across the European theater. By December 21, the restrictions were lifted. For the first time, American gunners in Europe were free to unleash the full potential of this new World War II artillery. German units quickly learned that something had changed. Patrols caught in the open were shredded by airbursts they never heard coming. In places like the Hurtgen Forest, bodies were found with wounds so severe that one American ordnance officer described the effect as a meat grinder. Then came the night on the Sauer River near Echternach, Luxembourg. A German battalion gathered along the banks, preparing to cross. There was little cover, no deep trenches, no bunkers carved into the hillside, just men, equipment, and the dark. American observers called in fire. Batteries loaded proximity-fused shells and fired a concentrated barrage over the river and its crowded shore. This time, there were no near misses. The rounds burst above the massed troops, sweeping the riverbank with steel from directly overhead. There was nowhere to hide, no time to move, no shelter from fragments angling down into every fold of ground. In a letter to the War Department, General George Patton described the result with brutal clarity. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. Under similar conditions, conventional shells might have killed dozens. With the proximity fuse, one barrage killed hundreds. In a single night on a cold riverbank, the assumptions that had guided generations of artillery doctrine, dig deep, stay low, ride out, the storm collapsed. And across the front, German soldiers began to understand that in the Battle of the Bulge, even the ground above their heads was no longer neutral. The arrival of the proximity fuse on European battlefields did more than tip the scales during a desperate winter offensive. It forced a fundamental shift in how armies understood artillery power, defensive positions, and even the psychology of survival under fire. Long before the war's end, commanders on both sides realized that a new era of warfare had quietly begun, one in which the very concept of cover had been rewritten. For Germany, the immediate impact was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had designed its infantry doctrine around the assumption that trenches, foxholes, and log bunkers could shield soldiers from most artillery effects. That belief had been valid for decades. A shell that detonated at ground level sent its force outward, not downward. A soldier dug deep enough could survive even a close blast. But proximity-fused shells detonated overhead, turning every defensive position into a funnel for shrapnel. Troops in the Ardennes quickly learned that even a well-constructed bunker could be penetrated by high-velocity fragments raining from above. Reports from captured German soldiers revealed the psychological shock. Units ordered to advance into areas known to be covered by American artillery sometimes refused to leave their bunkers. Others attempted to charge with their hands raised, shouting "Kamerad," hoping to surrender rather than face another barrage. The sense of helplessness was unlike anything they had experienced. They could not hear the shells, could not anticipate the bursts, and could not find shelter from the fragments falling vertically like steel sleet. On the American side, the fuse's impact on operational planning was immediate. Commanders discovered they could break up massed formations, halt river crossings, and destroy assembly areas with a fraction of the ammunition previously required. Fire missions that once demanded careful observation and precise timing now required only an approximate target location. The fuse handled the rest, detonating at the ideal height regardless of weather, terrain, or visibility. This proved decisive during the weeks of heavy overcast that initially grounded Allied aircraft during the Bulge. What should have been ideal weather for German movement turned into a death trap the moment proximity fuses entered the fight. Strategically, the fuse accelerated the collapse of German offensive capability in the west. The Ardennes counteroffensive relied on speed, concentration, and the ability to overwhelm thin American lines. But proximity-fused artillery punished concentration more severely than any previous weapon. German battalions caught in forests, towns, river crossings, or assembly zones were shattered before they could attack or regroup. By late January 1945, when the Bulge finally closed, Allied commanders openly credited the fuse with helping prevent a far deeper German penetration toward Antwerp. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the proximity fuse reshaped artillery doctrine for the post-war world. The assumption that infantry could survive bombardment through entrenchment alone, an idea born in World War I, was gone. Armies now had to disperse, dig deeper, and avoid static defenses that could be targeted by airburst fire. Future doctrines emphasized mobility, counter-battery fire, and electronic warfare to neutralize increasingly precise and deadly artillery systems. In the end, the proximity fuse did more than make artillery deadlier. It changed how armies conceived a protection itself. The sky, once merely the medium through which shells traveled, had become a weapon. The proximity fuse was not the kind of invention that appeared in newspapers or inspired patriotic posters. It arrived quietly hidden inside a steel casing, classified at the same level as the atomic bomb, assembled by workers who never knew what they were building. Yet, on the battlefields of 1944, 1945, it reshaped the course of the war with a decisiveness few weapons in history have ever matched. In the skies over the Pacific, it blunted the kamikaze threat. In the forests of the Ardennes, it robbed the German army of its last real chance to change the war's momentum. And along the Sauer River, it demonstrated a level of lethality that forced even hardened commanders like General Patton to rethink the future of warfare. Its legacy endures not because of a single dramatic moment, but because it transformed a fundamental truth of combat, that survival could no longer be guaranteed by the ground beneath one's feet. The people who built it are mostly forgotten, but the world they helped shape is not.